Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty radical in climate action.
Yes, it's a challenging idea. We're examining a viewpoint that suggests the way climate scientists have communicated for, well, 50 years.
It has basically failed.
Yeah.
Catastrophically failed, even.
That's the argument. Yeah. And because of that perceived failure, there's a call to start actively researching climate interventions. Geoengineering.
Okay.
We're digging into a key Viewpoint article from September 2025. It's not just one voice. It synthesizes input from 27 people, academics, activists.
And crucially, people living in the Arctic.
Exactly. And their core message is this. We need a strategic shift, away from just warning about consequences.
Towards something they call compassionate harm reduction.
Precisely. So our mission today is to unpack why they're calling for this, look at the big ethical questions, moral hazard, the slippery slope idea.
And really focus on why the Arctic and the people there have to be absolutely central if this goes anywhere. Okay, so this central idea, failure. What was the old model? The one that's supposedly broken.
Well, it's known as the consequences-based paradigm.
Right.
And it ran on basically one big assumption, a faulty one, it turns out.
Which was?
That if scientists just, clearly and repeatedly laid out the negative impacts of warming, sea level rise, extreme weather, all that.
Then policymakers and the public would naturally mobilize. They'd demand deep decarbonization.
That was the hope, the theory.
But after decades of these warnings,
the action just hasn't matched the warnings. It does. And, other research talked about stabilizing at 0.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A nice idea. But our sources flatly state that's impossible now. Long gone.
Yeah.
We're already sitting at 1.5 degrees.
Wait, we blew past that preferred target, the 0.91?
We did.
And the whole strategy was kind of based on not blowing past it. Wow, okay, that urgency. I can see how that forces a rethink.
It absolutely forces a rethink.
Yeah.
If the primary goal, limiting warming to those lower levels, failed, then the moral calculus shifts. That's where compassionate harm reduction comes in.
Okay, harm reduction. That term usually makes people think of like public health issues. How does it apply here? And isn't researching geoengineering completely at odds with cutting emissions?
Well, the authors argue forcefully. No, they're not mutually exclusive. Not at all.
Oh, so?
The moral imperative under this new paradigm is simply to minimize harm to humanity, period.
Okay.
So that means we have a duty to thoroughly understand any potential tool, any intervention that might reduce suffering, that might lessen catastrophic damage.
While still pushing for decarbonization.
Absolutely. Decarbonization remains essential. But harm reduction means looking at all the tools in the toolbox, not just the one we wish had worked better.
So this puts a different kind of burden on scientists, doesn't it? Not just report the problem, but actively explore potential messy solutions.
Exactly. You hear people saying, stop the research, it's too uncertain.
Right.
But the counterargument here is, suppressing the science guarantees ignorance. How can you know the risks or benefits if you refuse to even look?
Yeah, if there's even a chance these tools could help people, especially in really vulnerable places, polar regions, low-lying coasts.
And the ethical duty, they argue, is to study them rigorously, figure out if they work, what the side effects are, how they could possibly be governed. You can't assess risk in a vacuum. And that naturally leads to, okay, where would this research, especially field trials, happen?
The Arctic seems like the obvious candidate, geographically. More accessible than Antarctica.
Right. But that raises a huge issue.
Sovereignty. The Arctic isn't some unclaimed territory like Antarctica. People live there. Nations have jurisdiction.
Precisely. And the source material is incredibly clear on this point, emphatically clear.
Which is?
Because the Arctic is not a global commons. The people who live there, Arctic peoples, must be central to any decisions made. Full stop.
So what Washington or Brussels or Beijing wants is secondary.
Explicitly stated as secondary. The needs, rights, and knowledge of Arctic inhabitants come first.
Okay, so how does that actually work? This idea of knowledge co-production blending academic science with traditional knowledge?
Well, there are structures emerging. The University of the Arctic, for instance, has set up a review process. It's specifically for these high-latitude intervention ideas.
And it's led by?
Led by the Sami Council. And Gunbert Redder from the council basically said, yes, we have to face these ideas, we have to evaluate them, but it must be grounded in a rights-based perspective. That's the foundation. Non-negotiable.
And you get these really complex views from within those communities, too. The source mentions Pirita Nekkalervi,
president of the Sami parliament in Finland.
Yes. Her argument is basically, Look, the risk of blowing past 1.5 degrees is so huge, we have to keep all research options on the table.
But it's not just abstract risk calculation. When they asked Greenlanders about this research,
Yeah.
the reasons were fascinating. One was sort of global empathy, solidarity with poorer communities elsewhere facing sea level rise, a sense of duty.
Okay, that's powerful.
But the other was totally local, totally practical. Sea levels dropping slightly around parts of Greenland.
Dropping. Why?
Isostatic rebound, maybe? Land rising as ice melts? Whatever the cause, it meant boats were suddenly hitting rocks, submerged islets that used to be deep underwater.
Ah, so it was directly impacting their lives, their safety, their work.
Exactly. It wasn't just about saving the world, it was about navigating their own waters safely. It brings it down to a very human level.
Right. This is all deeply uncomfortable, though, which is why the arguments against doing this research are so loud and frankly persuasive to many. Let's tackle the big one, moral hazard.
Mm-hmm. The mitigation deterrence argument.
The idea that if we even research a techno-fix like geoengineering, politicians and the public will just give up on the hard work of cutting emissions.
Yeah. Oh, good. We have a plan B, so we can relax about plan A.
Is there evidence for that? Does research actually deter mitigation?
Well, the evidence is murky. It's mixed. Surveys of public attitudes don't show strong support for that idea.
How interesting.
In fact, there's some evidence just as strong pointing the other way. Meaning that the very idea of something as drastic as geoengineering can actually shock people into taking decarbonization more seriously. Like, wow, if scientists are considering that, things must be really bad. We need to cut emissions now.
Huh. So the moral hazard isn't a slam dunk argument.
Not based on current evidence. Plus, there's an ethical issue with suppressing science just because you fear a political outcome. It feels like the same logic as the failed consequences model, trying to manage the public response instead of just doing the science.
Okay, what about the other common objection? The slippery slope. You start researching and boom, before you know it, we're deploying these things globally without thinking it through.
The authors push back on that. They call it a sticky slope, not a slippery one. Meaning there are breaks, it's not automatic. Research has to be governed ethically. There should be multiple checkpoints, decision points, before anything close to deployment happens.
Is there an example of this stickiness?
Yes, actually. The Arctic Ice Project. They were looking into brightening sea ice albedo modification.
Right.
But they stopped their research voluntarily because their own work raised concerns about the toxicity of the materials they planned to use, these hollow glass microspheres.
So the research itself acted as a brake, it revealed a risk, and they halted?
Exactly. Research found the problem, and that prevented moving towards deployment. It shows the slope isn't inevitably slippery.
Okay, and finally, there's a logical flaw they point out about dismissing everything.
Yeah, the induction fallacy.
Yeah.
And also single action bias, meaning just because some intervention ideas might be flawed or dangerous, you can't logically dismiss all of them. The source identifies, what, 61 distinct ideas for the Arctic alone?
61.
And more will emerge. Saying geoengineering is bad based on problems with one or two ideas is just bad logic. And the flip side is single action bias. Putting all your eggs in the decarbonization basket, as essential as it is, might mean neglecting other potential tools needed for this massive, complex crisis.
Okay, so if the old way failed, and the standard objections to researching new ways have flaws, how do we move forward? What kind of analysis do we need?
It absolutely has to be framed as risk assessment. That's crucial.
Risk. Meaning?
You don't compare an intervention against some imaginary perfect world with no climate change.
Yeah.
That ship has sailed. You compare the risks and benefits of doing something in intervention against the risks and benefits of doing nothing, or rather, doing only what we're currently doing. And both sides of that comparison have to be judged against realistic future scenarios, including scenarios with continued high greenhouse gas emissions.
Compare the risks of action versus the risks of inaction, given the likely future.
Precisely.
Is any of this research mature enough to actually do that kind of risk analysis? So much of it sounds like science fiction still.
Some is more mature than others. Research on stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, is probably the furthest along.
And what does that risk analysis show for SAI?
Well, generally the findings suggest that the projected negative impacts under an SAI scenario.
Like cooling the planet by putting aerosols in the stratosphere.
Correct. Those impacts are generally less severe and, importantly, often more equitable globally.
More equitable than what?
Than the impacts we'd expect under future scenarios with continued high greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow, okay. Less severe and more equitable. But what about side effects? Ozone layer, air quality, health.
Those are definitely part of the risk calculation. They are studied.
Yeah.
But the overall analyses, according to the source, tend to point towards significant net benefits compared to the high warming future we're otherwise heading for.
Net benefits like?
Economic benefits, positive effects on the cryosphere slowing ice melt, and a really striking finding on human health.
Which is?
The net human health gains under SAI scenarios, things like reduced heat stress deaths, are projected to outweigh the risks from potential air pollution or ozone effects by a factor of about 13.
13. A factor of 13 net positive on human health.
That's what the studies cite and suggest. It's a powerful number.
It really underscores that point the authors make, doesn't it? That the old fear-based messaging, just focusing on consequences, it didn't just fail, it might have even backfired. Maybe it paralyzed people or even pushed them towards parties who dismissed the problem entirely.
Exactly. It offered no agency, no hope, just dread. This harm reduction approach, they argue, built on actually exploring potential tools. It could offer the opposite, a sense of agency, maybe some cautious optimism, and actual strategies for managing the immense risks we now face. #tag outro.
So to wrap up, we've looked at how this consequences-based approach, despite decades of effort, just didn't generate the political will needed. We didn't hit the targets.
No. And so this proposed harm reduction paradigm is presented as a necessary pivot. It's about actively, but carefully and ethically, exploring all potential tools to minimize harm.
While keeping decarbonization absolutely central, it's not an either-or.
Definitely not. The core tension is that duty to act to minimize harm versus the fear that exploring solutions might somehow sabotage the main solution, decarbonization.
But the authors really stress, arguing to just shut down entire fields of research, that's a huge claim.
An extraordinary claim, they say, requiring extraordinary proof, especially when the alternative seems to be just accepting potentially catastrophic outcomes.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really difficult question, I think. If the risk of not researching the moral hazard of non-research, as the source puts it, includes devastating climate tipping points, especially hitting polar regions hard,
leading to massive socioeconomic damage.
can ethical worries about the research itself really justify waiting until it's potentially too late to even have the evidence on whether these interventions could have helped?
A tough question to end on, something to really think about.